The first half of the Peloponnesian War. The Corinthians pointed out other differences between Sparta and Athens as well. Athens was always bold beyond their own strength. They were willing to run risks, to take things into their own hands and to try and make things work. Whereas Sparta was always careful. They would act, even though they were extremely strong, they would act feeble because they didn't want to rush into things without thinking about them. Athens was constantly traveling. They were always sending their ships out to their members of the Delian League and traveling constantly, whereas Sparta always stayed at home. They really only cared for themselves. They were a very reserved sort of city-state that really just took care of their own empire, their own little kingdom of Sparta. Athens thought that the true self is your mind. Big focus on the mind, and they were always seeking more, but not enjoy. But the Corinthians were arguing they didn't enjoy what they had. They were always building, always constructing, but they didn't actually enjoy or appreciate what they had. And the Corinthian plea was to the Spartans, if you don't act now, Athens is soon going to take you over as well. We know that you think that you're so strong and so self-possessed and no one's ever going to touch you because you're Sparta, but we're saying that if you don't take action now, Athens is soon going to be coming to your doors to bring war to you. Now, the Athenians made a reply to the Corinthians, and they basically argued what they had traditionally argued. We saved everyone. During the war, it was thanks to us and our navy that the Persians were defeated, and basically said, you owe us. You were only concerned for yourself in the Peloponnesian War. You wanted to pull all the armies back to the isthmus. You let Athens burn. You were just basically concerned about preserving your own city. We actually were concerned about everybody else. Which was true. Sparta didn't really have a whole lot of concern for the Ionians or for the other Greeks. They were pretty much concerned for themselves. Athens had actually gone out of its way to help these other people, but in doing so, it had also made them subjects of Athens. And Athens basically said, look, if you had this empire, you would rule with a strong hand too, which we're going to find out later is true. Once Sparta does become the head of the empire, which is at the end of the Peloponnesian War, they are worse than the Athenians. And the Athenians also say war is a matter of chance. Either one of us could win or lose. So do you really want to start this thing? Do you really want to go to war between the two major cities here of Greece? And essentially Sparta says yes. In 431, they decide to ally with other Greek city-states like Corinth and to go up against Athens. And basically this long, drawn-out war begins. About a 30-year long war. It's not a world war. It's not including all of Persia coming over and attacking Greece, but it's a civil war. So it actually has a lot of similarities to American history. In American history, we fought our Revolutionary War, where we tried to, or where we broke free from Britain and we became independent. That's kind of like the Greco-Persian War. Greece breaks away from Persia and retains its independence, but then it's followed by a civil war between Athens and Sparta. Just how in the the Civil War in America, there was a war between the North and the South, and the North was the more liberal party. The South was more conservative. Both of them, in this case, were built on the backs of slaves in Greece. In the American War, in the American Civil War, obviously the South was more dependent on slaves. But in any case, this is about 50 years after the Greco-Persian War, and there's some big things we need to realize. So Athens is the sea power. Their strength is their navy. Sparta is a land power. Their strength is their land. We have a democracy, freedom-loving democracy here, and we have here an oligarchy, right? Not a democratic state. Not everybody gets to vote. We have the two-king system and basically a small group of ruling assembly members who rule in Sparta. And then we have Athens, who needs corn and grain from foreign places, and we have Sparta, who is self-sufficient. They can survive all by themselves. Now, given what we've already said about Athens and Sparta and their different strengths, Sparta, right, was a strong land power. Athens was a strong power at sea. The problem is that Sparta is a landlocked city. It doesn't have ports. It's not connected to the ocean in any way. So Athens was not able to just sail up and attack Sparta in that way. But Athens was in the middle of a plain. Even though they were also a port city, they had a port, they were in the middle of a plain that they depended on for food supplies every year. And so basically Sparta came up and for a number of years just ravaged that plain. And the policy of Pericles, he knew that if they faced off with the Spartans on the field of battle, on a land battle, their chances of survival were slim. They were probably not going to win. And so they decided that they were going to protect themselves within their city. So every year, the Spartans would come up into the plain here surrounding Athens, this area of Attica, and basically burn and pillage this entire area. And Athens, all the Athenian citizens would gather within the city walls and watch from the walls as Sparta would come in and just burn everything around them. And this was extremely demoralizing. It was extremely difficult to watch as their lands were destroyed. And over time, it became not only demoralizing, but actually deadly. Because if you remember, the Athenians had built the long walls from the city to their port. These long, narrow walls leading down to their port, the Piraeus. And what happened was basically the plague came to them through their port. A ship arrived in the Piraeus carrying the plague, and it spread from the harbor, from the Piraeus, into the heart of Athens. And this plague was terrible. According to Thucydides, this plague was terrifying. People would feel as though they were on fire from the insides. They would run through the streets screaming for water, and they would drink and drink water, and nothing could satisfy their burning thirst. They would have rashes and boils all over the outside of their bodies as well, so they were literally burning from the outside and the inside. It was a terrible plague. And thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Athens died, and that whole long corridor of the long walls just became filled with dead bodies, and the city of Athens itself was filled with dead bodies. And this is all going on as they're watching outside the walls, the Spartans just destroying the land surrounding them. Now, they were able to survive because they still had their harbor, the Piraeus, and because Sparta was not a naval power, Athens was still able to bring supplies in through its harbor and give itself food during this time. But the plague really broke the spirit of the Athenians. They had come into this coming out of their golden age, right? Their height of perfection, the perfect citizen in the perfect state. They had built the amazing Parthenon and many other temples and incredible structures. They had had sculptors create things that we still model today. We still make models of today, these beautiful sculptures, and yet now all of that is being completely destroyed by war. And they blamed Pericles. Pericles was the one who in many ways had kind of pushed them to build this empire, to be a threat. He was the one who had advised them to stay within the walls and to not face off against the Spartans in battle on land. And eventually Pericles himself got the plague and died after giving a final speech. And he said one of the best things that he had ever done was that no Athenian ever wore mourning for the dead because of him. So essentially the idea is that he had been for Athens. He had not oppressed the Athenians in any way. He had not caused them unnecessarily to suffer. He had always thought highly of the city and been for the common people, which was true. But he also was one who had really, and he had done many things. He had finished the long walls. He had strengthened Athenian power. They had become an empire under him. And yet that becoming an empire had been part of what led them to this huge conflict that they were now a part of. One of the problems of this democracy that Pericles had created, he had formed a democracy. He had been for the common people. He had wanted them to be able to be part of government. But by creating these annual elections where they would elect new leaders every year, which gave people opportunities to be a part of the government, and commoners, low people. It wasn't just nobles. It was the poor Athenians. Now, not slaves, not medics, but Athenians, freeborn Athenians who were just poor could be part of government. But this is where one of the problems of democracy came into play. the weakness of democracy is that it has built into it a certain amount of instability, because you're constantly having policies shift and change, and especially if it's every year, as new leaders came into power, they had new policies, new ideas about how the government should be run, and so you constantly have this overturn of the way things had been before, and Pericles was able to kind of hold things together. He was a strong leader, and even though there was this instability, he himself was a stable person. So he was able to kind of hold together all those various pieces. But once he disappeared, the tensions in that system began to destroy Athens from the inside out. All those different voices began to pull it apart, especially with the tension of war with Sparta coming from the outside. Now, after Pericles' death, because the Spartans had been destroying the land around Athens for years, food became very scarce. Even though they still had their shipping routes, it wasn't enough to supply Athens, and their prices were high. It was just a bad time. And so Sparta was also suffering from this. Every summer when they would go off to attack and invade Athens, their fields at home would suffer. They were also lacking food because they weren't coming back and caring for their fields enough to get good harvests. So both city-states are struggling for food, literally just for food. But Athens rejected the peace offered by Sparta. And during this time, there's some playwrights in Athens who are writing, like Aristophanes, and he holds nothing back in criticizing those who are leading the war effort. He writes some very scathing plays critiquing people. I think I've talked about one of them before, The Clouds, where he criticizes Plato and has Plato up in a crane in the sky like he's a god or something, giving his words of wisdom to the people below. And he's basically just mocking Plato outright and saying that he's a fool. And overall, the war really destroyed the idealism of the Athenian society. They had built this perfect society, and the war just kind of demolished it all. People were still there, but their sense of high ideals, of the glory of Athens, of perfection, all of that began to be lost. And instead, anger and suspicion took hold. People began to fight amongst each other, to hate each other. Politics became more embattled after Pericles was dead. And the new leader who arose, Cleon, was not capable of holding everyone together. He could not inspire the people to their high ideals that Pericles had done, and Athens became more and more embittered against itself. And then Athens began a policy of taxing its allies double. They had always taxed their allies, but they began to tax them double to provide for the war, and that broke their treaty with them and really made these allies want any possible excuse to fight back against to Athens, to rebel against Athens. During these years, there was a really successful attack made by the Athenians over on the west side of the Peloponnesus. Over here on the coast, they were able to take a garrison that belonged to the Spartans. It was quite an intense battle. And it was pretty glorious for the Athenians, and that was a huge strength to them, a huge encouragement. But while that was happening, a Spartan general, Brasidas, led his troops in a daring move, not only up to the plain of Attica, but further north, up into Thessaly, up north of Athens in this area, and began to encourage these a city-state up here to rebel against Athens. And at the time, Cleon was actually in that city trying to convince them to stay with Athens, to remain with Athens. And in the battle that ensued, both of these individuals, Brasidas and Cleon, who were two of the main leaders of Sparta and Athens at the time, both were killed and taken off the table. And the general who was actually on his way at the time trying to make it to Athens, or trying to make it to this city-state, and didn't make it in time, was Thucydides. And Thucydides ends up becoming the author of a book, The Peloponnesian War, where he tells all about this great war. And then finally, in 421, Nicias, an Athenian general, was able to establish a peace. Both of the leading generals of the two city-states were gone, Cleon and Brasidas, and he was able to establish a peace that lasted for about 50 years.